We are live, or are we alive? It's been Climate Week, what happened last week, and we are trying to recover still. I personally, I fell asleep on the train this morning, so
Wow.
bad it is. But anyways, man, how are you doing? You feeling all right after Climate Week?
Yeah, I'm doing all right. It was genuinely a blur. I think that might have been the fastest week of the year. I looked up and it was the end of September. So, you know, what time flies when you're having fun, but also, how much fun did we have? Let's see.
A lot, man. Honestly, I was doing really well, like keeping up with my to-dos, like follow-ups for the day of for the first like 2 days, and then it just totally fell off a cliff. But I think that's kind of how it works. But anyways, in case you guys didn't realize, we are coming back to you after Climate Week with our little bit of a Climate Week debrief episode, if you will. So we're going to toss out a few different areas and give our kind of quick takes on each of those point by point. Please also do note that we have a survey running through the week, through the end of this week, and we're collecting just public feedback generally on what you guys thought of Climate Week. Check out the show notes to offer your perspective. The kind of key things we're looking for are really like what events were good in your opinion and what events were bad, and what you're going to do differently next year. Because I think there is a little bit of a discussion happening right now around should Climate Week be a week earlier, and how can we make the most out of this? Because honestly, it's just a little too chaotic. But share your feedback there, and we're going to summarize all that information, kind of put it up publicly so others can use it for their own benefit. All right, let's get into it. So, I guess to kick us off with kind of your favorite event of the week, or favorite events of the week.
Yeah. So my favorite event, this is, I think, going to be a lot of people's favorites, but one was the Climate Tech Exits event by Third Sphere. And another was a pretty high profile political risk event I attended, hosted by my good friends at Oric, along with a bunch of other really smart people in climate. So essentially, these two events were events where I learned something, right? The Climate Tech Exits event was about the exits and M&A landscape in climate and what to do about it. The political risk event was essentially breaking down, what are some of the minutia about what's affected given a potential administration change, and also, even if not, a continuation of the current Democratic administration. But again, this year I got the feeling that a lot of people cared about how their events felt rather than what people got out of them. It's almost like they were statements about brand recognition. So my favorite events were the events where I actually learned something, where people brought people together to discuss new information, not
Mm-hmm.
rehashing the same posturing that I could feel or find on LinkedIn.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think for me, I second the Third Sphere event. Obviously, we were both at that one, and I think that Third Sphere always has good content. I mean, they really spend a lot of time thinking about these things. So that one was definitely top notch for me in terms of a content perspective. There's also very good people there. The second one, in my opinion, my favorite one was Climate Capital Summit by Equal Ventures. Always very good people in the room, very good topics. I also like it because I just kind of plan to be there the whole day, so it's a little less hectic. You can just hang out, get some work done between sessions. So I like that a lot. And then the New Lab event, the New Lab Climate, I think it's called New Climate Futures event. That was actually really good. I wouldn't, I guess I could say a little bit surprised because I didn't know necessarily what to expect, but it was really helpful for me to, because every startup that's there has a little booth basically, and you can read really quickly like what they're working on, get a TLDR, and then decide, do I really want to talk to them? And it was just very valuable for networking. Also, tons of people there, but it was enough space that people could get around. Great food, so it was honestly just a really really fun event that was totally different than the other two, but I liked it. I liked it
Yeah.
quite a lot.
I've been to a
Um,
couple different booth related and booth style events throughout New York Climate Week, and even New York Climate Week and other conferences, and I think the booth startup sort of like matching has always been a really good format. Moving
yeah,
on
yeah.
to our least favorite events. Yeah, kick it off here because I feel pretty passionate about this. I'm calling this VC hangouts. I would say there was a lot of hanging out and catching up, but I would say barely any real connecting and learning from me, right? With all these events, and also I think what I would say is across the board, the increase in quality of the events, which is on one hand a good thing. Instead of being able to choose the 1 to 2 events a day that we gave, right, as advice towards the beginning of the week, I personally was faced with three to four good quality events where I really couldn't make the decision not to go, and I had to attend those each day. And that means that to start with, the actual selection was something like 6 to 10. So realistically, it's hard to tell people not to have events, but I do think that it made everyone pretty surface level at the events that they were attending because they were kind of in the routine of just get in, stop by, say hi, and go. And I think that was not I was not a fan of that.
Yeah, I do think there. there'll be a lot more consolidation, hopefully, and partnering next year for like bigger events between the smaller organizations that can partner together. Obviously, it's a little bit challenging to work and coordinate with other people and get them on board, but it'd be good to see that. I mean, I think for me, it might have been similar. The least favorite events, I won't say any one in particular, but it was just these like bar networking events that were usually far too loud and way too packed that it was impossible to hear anything. I literally lost my voice on Monday, the first day, because you just have to shout, literally shouting in this bar that's so loud. You can't really meet people, or when you do meet people, you're kind of like sometimes you're stuck talking to them for the whole night because you can't get out of the corner. Like you just literally can't move throughout the room. So I do not want those. I also want if those are going to be the types of events that are happening, like if everybody in that room was a certain type of person, if it was curated perfectly, that would be fine. Like because then I know whether or not I want to go. But if it's just like a huge random smattering of people, that's pretty tough for me to get on board with.
I also think those events were events that started off trying to be curated and then expanded. And that's a theme that I saw of my least favorite events this year was that things that were meant to be curated and even advertised as curated ended up not being.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that there's probably some level of like fear that not a lot of people are going to show up because this whole thing where people they subscribed and they sign up to go to every single event. So you've got like probably six times as many signups as people are going to actually show. And then the organizers get a little bit worried that nobody's going to show up, so they let too many people in. And then before you know it, you've got this current situation. So there needs to be a solution for that. And I think that this goes to a whole issue of other people being too greedy with their events. Like, I want to go to everything. So they sign up and they're like, I'm going to try to get into everything and then I'll decide. I think that's the wrong way to go about it. I think similar to like finding a job, you should be focused on the roles, the events that you really want to get into rather than just trying to go to everything. What was your, I guess, biggest takeaway from the week in general?
Yeah, I appreciate you letting me go first here. And bear with me. It's going to sound jarring, but innovation was at its lowest. And I mean lowest. I think for many years up until now, people were figuring things out in climate, right? In climate tech, there were a lot of open questions. I mean, last year was the year of folk, right? Folk financing. So just to begin with, people were kind of getting familiar with, okay, we're starting to understand what the solutions to climate tech might be. I think this is inherently a good thing. Most people in the space are founders and investors who have a shared understanding of what best practices are and what the challenges we haven't solved are. But for that reason, it almost felt like we were agreeing with each other too much, right? Everyone was kind of knew what to say, said the same things, panels resulted in the same kind of advice, and I felt like that didn't really leave that much room for innovation. I have one more really strong point to make, but I'll cut it off there. What for you was the biggest takeaway?
I mean, I think with what you're saying, I don't necessarily know if I have an opinion one way or the next, but for me, the biggest thing was I think Climate Week is now effectively just mostly helpful for catching up with your friends and then meeting people you haven't seen in real life or you've met online before, but meeting them in real life for the first time. I think it's really hard to do client development at this point. I mean, there might be some ways you can get around that by hosting your own events, perhaps, but for me, that was the biggest thing. Was like it just felt like everybody is just saying hi to each other. Like you and I think we're similar to a lot of people that even though we have a podcast, we've also got a lot of other people are still just constantly networking in the space. So you see so many people that you've been talking to or interacting with on LinkedIn, and you want to say hi to them. And before you know it, you spend 15 minutes catching up with people, and or each person, and then before you know it, the event's over and you haven't met a single new person.
Do you feel like those conversations elevated anything, about your relationship with them, or was it generally just kind of like a show face and say hi?
I mean, definitely, there's a few times where it solidifies kind of the relationship, if you will, or maybe some new things will come out of it. Like I learn that they have a particular problem they're trying to solve. So there's definitely some value in it, but at the same time, I think there needs to be a better way to do this, like to get those catch ups in while also still focusing on like
Yeah.
getting a couple of deep conversations with new people because or at the bare minimum if I'm going to have a catch up with them, why don't I just schedule time to actually have like a coffee with them during the week, which nobody wants to do because they're all going to events. So that's the challenging part is like I don't know. I think it's kind of like you've got a foot in both camps and you end up missing out on both possible benefits.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time thinking about this, especially as the week ended. I feel like this might be unique to us because I feel like within climate, the benefit of what we do is if we send an email, people respond. So I think we might be coming from a position where we're talking to a lot of our friends and people that we have access to. I do think that I noticed that I was able to get access to people that are outside of my orbit, but still good people to know. So in that way, I think being in person with them established a level of familiarity that might have taken me 3 months to get, right? But I think the issue is that I wasn't really in spaces where I felt like I was building in any single direction, right? Even being at specific investor events, a lot of investors, quote unquote, were people that were very specific about what they do. And, if you're going to put a biotech investor and a built environment investor in the same space, yes, they're both climate tech, but they probably don't have that much to talk to each other about in theory. So I think that was, something that really struck to me. Again, looking more at the investment side. I want to take a second to do a small rant because also I had the opportunity to attend some really high profile events at sort of the other major thing that's happening during New York Climate Week, which is UNGA Week, which is basically where the UN hosts many presidents, ministers, and the richest business people on the planet, especially from other countries and continents like Africa. So in that, panel after panel, people talked about how much they wanted to invest in energy. These are emerging markets, developing markets. They want to invest in energy infrastructure, energy security. Like all of this mattered to them. And the whole time I'm listening, I'm in the audience, I'm sitting in my seat, along with, friends that aren't climate friends, but people that I know. And I realize, I look around, I'm the only person of my peers in this room. So if climate matters to them, and the climate communities of the climate tech capital of the world are not there, they are having to choose between New York Climate Week and UNGA Week. That creates a fundamental flaw that is destroying our ability to execute and pay attention to climate in places like Africa, in developing markets, basically anywhere that's not the US. And I think that is a huge, huge issue.
Yeah, I guess it's an interesting perspective. I guess I have really a big challenge with this whole like there's just so many conferences, right? If you look at some of these people who like they're doing business development, at least some of the people I follow on LinkedIn, it's like from beginning of September through to the end of like October, all they're going to be doing is going from conference to conference, right? And I kind of have an issue with that. I'd rather people pick the things that make the most sense for them. Like, a lot of people ask me if I was going to go to RE Plus, and I'm like, no, I don't really work in renewables, so why would I go there? Just because I want to meet cool people, maybe, but like, it's not worth me taking a whole trip when I could be delivering for my clients. And I think that there has to be some level of just like, hey, what is the most valuable thing for me to do and focus on it. Yes, we could split the 2 weeks and get people to go to that. But I also think that, maybe a perspective to counter what you're saying is that if, New York Climate Week isn't necessarily about the global situation. Obviously, it is kind of like the global summit for climate, but I think that a lot of people there are really just focused on innovation and building. And if you want to see more like specific talk about how to invest in Africa, for example, it might make more sense to attend the Africa Climate Summit that they do usually, I think, once a year.
But I think what I'm saying is we have to make like an inherent choice, whether we care about it or not, to go to UNGA or to go to New York Climate Week. I say this because I had to pass on a lot of really great events that I know we would have been at, right? We would have been hanging out at if I didn't have to choose between the two. So yes, I think while people all are there to focus on innovation and building, they don't have the opportunity to choose that because it's kind of like an either or. And yeah, if you're just looking at Africa out of interest versus your career is in, US climate tech or Europe climate tech, you're going to choose New York Climate Week.
But
So,
but who are the people that should really attend UNGA? Like, are they meant to be the average people like us, or is it supposed to be like big fund managers and other things like that? Like
well, I
people who are running huge organizations? Because that's what my take would be is like, how much value am I actually going to get out of being in that room personally? Like maybe you, but not me so much.
yeah, I mean, it depends what you define as average people like us, right? If we're talking about people who are active in climate, I think if you have an ability to either deploy capital or support entrepreneurs, you can be in that room, right? I think right now it has to be a who knows who because there isn't enough communication happening between the two sides, right? So there aren't that many events talking about climate tech in Africa because if they hosted something like that, they wouldn't get a lot of people. They might get a lot of the people in Africa talking to each other, but not enough people who have capital, who say they invest globally, but who have the capacity to attend the event. That doesn't exist because you're having to choose
Hmm.
between the two. So what I'm saying is opening up that pool of people who, even if just out of interest, are able to attend.
Yeah, maybe it'd be interesting to see how next year if they like if somebody decides, hey, we're going to divide this week up into maybe they do it the week before, like everybody's talking about, but maybe they divide it up into, there's going to be a whole day dedicated to events that surround like Africa stuff, for example, or Southeast Asia, whatever it is. Like you kind of divide the week up into topic areas so that hopefully people can be at least in a similar
Yeah.
part of Manhattan doing
Yeah.
their events and then, talking about the same things. But I think this is beyond, obviously you and I aren't the ones organizing Climate Week as a whole. So hopefully Climate Group does something about that and tries to, like, I guess you could say, seek more organization and collaboration there. We've sort of talked about it already, but what would you say is your biggest gripe about Climate Week?
Yeah, I feel like half of my points have turned into gripes. I did have a good time, everyone. I just think I spent a lot of time trying to think about how to make the most of the week, and I realized you were kind of at a loss to begin with. I do think that the biggest sort of like problem that I felt, if I had to summarize it all into one, is echo chambers. I keep using the word posturing because I feel like posturing on panels and events left more questions than gave me answers, right? So the example I use is, what do you think of the election would do to climate tech? And the answer was something like, well, there's still great technology out there and we still have to try, although yeah, it might be harder. Like no shit. Like what I'm looking for are actionable ways that affect how I should be advising founders, investors, and climate tech entrepreneurs about the specifics, right? If you think about why we had Susan Sue from Toba Capital on our podcast to talk about her article, it was because it gave us something that could anchor, hey, if you're a founder, maybe pay attention to executive orders or maybe try and build a relationship with the loan office, right? Because you can break it down into its parts. And I actually mentioned that article to a lot of people throughout the week. And they also agreed that single-handedly probably delivered a lot more value than some of these panels. So all of the sort of talking that did the idea of like, okay, we have this great thing and this great thing and this great thing. Like, I understand that. I work with so many great people, but I need to know, I need for you to make a decision for me, in terms of what should I be focusing on.
Yeah, I mean, I understand that. I think that you just have to understand who's hosting the event because you've got really two kinds of events. You've got people who are, well, I'd say three maybe, but two of them fall into the same bucket. It's like people who are kind of tourists in climate who are really just scratching the surface of the topics and they don't know how to get into the weeds because they haven't spent the time. And then in that same bucket would be kind of in my opinion, the events that are run by the elites, right? Their language that they use is not specifically to be actionable. They talk in a way that's general and that kind of like strokes each other's egos, right? That's one type of event, and then you got on the other side of the spectrum events like Third Sphere, which is like highly specific to the point, like in the weeds of what you can do, and then you can have use that as kind of a discussion point for all the rest of the people you talk with at the event after the conversation is done or the presentation is done, to really then go into the weeds of some of these things. And I think that you just have to be aware of those and realize when you're in the wrong bucket of event types.
Yeah. So
The
so what was your biggest gripe?
Yeah, for me, I would say the big thing is overall just like there's too much noise, right? I think I've already talked about this before, but I just want there to be a better way to sort through the events and who's attending so that you can have it better curated because you have to be very specific about what your time is, where you're going to spend your time, and if people can be more transparent about who is going to be in attendance, it allows it for each people to kind of self-select where they want to attend. So that would be my biggest thing. But again, kind of already mentioned that.
So now moving on, and we talked enough about this year. What are you thinking about doing differently next year?
Yeah, I think for me, my main resolution is I'm going to aim to attend really like one main event per day and then host my own curated events. And then the rest, I think I'll just be focusing on one-on-one meetings. So maybe pick what I deem as the most important event for each day. And I'm just going to say, hey, I can't make it to the rest of them. That's fine. And then maybe do like a small of my own small happy hour or something where I just invite people that I want in the same room so I can curate it that I think those people are going to get along together well. And then have one-on-ones the rest of the week. That's my main thing.
Yeah, I think for me, I want to try and find the spaces where people are actually having discussions, right? I think that's been the major theme of everything that I've said today. I think that means doing a little pre-digging into which panels and topics are actually sort of expected to teach us things. And one thing I think will happen is as people digest this New York Climate Week, right? New York Climate Week 2024, I think a few winners in terms of who hosted the good events will emerge, right? That's kind of how Third Sphere got its claim to fame last year. And so I'm expecting that to happen again. So as that happens, I think it'll give us a sense of where are the real conversations happening and who can we expect to facilitate those again. Also, small plug here, putting on our own event and more live podcasts. So more on that in the next episode, but that is something that will be a lot different next year.
Yeah, no, I think we definitely have to host our own things to get the right people together. I guess for you, did you have any particular main themes, if you will, from the week?
Yeah, actually, so this comes from sort of the investing perspective, and this might be a hot take, but I don't think deal flow is an alpha in climate tech. And so that's like a lot of jargon in one sentence, right? Deal flow means that the companies that you get to meet, that you get to see, that you can pass around and refer around. And when I say alpha, it refers to like usually in general venture, the companies you can see and that you have access to is an alpha because if you see an Uber before anyone else sees an Uber and you develop that relationship, you can invest in them earlier, right? And usually with better terms. If you're seeing them, 6 months after they get famous, the competition is going to just be much harder. So normally that's usually why deal flow sharing happens in general, venture and software investing because you're trying to share, hot companies with the people around you. But I don't think that's an alpha in climate tech. So, and what I mean is because fundraising in climate is hard or at least harder because of, longer timelines and higher capex, people generally know which companies exist. Right? I can't tell you how many times I've been like, "Oh, let me, I wonder if they've heard of this company." And most times they have, right? So most investors know the founders in their range and in their space. What I think the advantage or the alpha really is on the relationships with later stage financing. And that also ties into the ability for these investors and supporters to be able to secure partnerships and customers for startups. I think that's why, for example, at the Climate Tech Exits event, you saw such an emphasis on CVCs and strategics getting so much noise because they are inherently those relationships that you want to build. So I think a theme of mine is that people are starting to notice what is important in climate in order to succeed long term.
Nice. Well, I'm glad to hear that. I like that. For me, there would be, I guess, two major themes. One is folk isn't real, and I know that next podcast episode coming out is literally us in our live episode talking about folk with Yair from Extantia. But I I have a lot of opinions, and I just think that from most of the conversations I've had, folk financing is just not a real thing. And the second theme would be that achieving private equity style returns is all that matters in climate hardware because when you are in the room with private equity people, all they talk about is deployment, deployment, deployment. And you cannot deploy billions of dollars if you're doing a lot of small, like $5 million, $10 million checks in startups or on pilot projects. You need to be able to say, okay, listen, the returns are, we're gonna get 8% for 30 years or whatever it is, like something private equity is happy with, and they will dump money into it, hand over fist, just to get these projects building. So that has to be kind of like the city on the hill objective for any hardware company in climate. Those are my two major themes. All right, everybody, thank you so much for tuning in today. We've got two last things to close you out with. As I mentioned at the beginning, we have this survey we're running on what you thought the best events were and the worst events were and why behind those, as well as what you're going to do differently next year. As we talked about, we need more coordination. So please give us your input. The link can be found in the description. Share it with your friends. This will be open for about a week, and then we'll share the data publicly so other people can utilize it for themselves.
The second thing is that we will be putting out the recording of our first ever live podcast recording next episode on Thursday. This was super fun, and I want to give a huge shout out to Yair Reem and the Extantia team for collaborating with us to make this happen. Most excitingly of all, be on the lookout for what we plan to take action on in Climate Week New York 2025.
All right, everybody. Thanks for listening. See you next time.